I think we're live. Yep. Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. And thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Hungary, that smallish country in Central Europe that's decided to maintain the sovereignty of their government. That is, when I say sovereignty, I'm talking about the people elect their representatives, and those representatives represent the people who elected them. Now, this is in stark contrast to the entire Western world, where the people elect their representatives, and those representatives in the Western world all report into the globalists. They're just flunkies, stooges, and hangers-on and passengers that are directed, controlled, and ordered about by the globalists. You will do this, you will do that. And so the West or Western governments, other than on matters that are irrelevant to the globalists, the Western world has no sovereign governments left. I mean, look at the government of Britain, for example, or the United States, or indeed other places. So this is an interesting case here. What do the globalists do when a government maintains its sovereignty? That is, its sovereignty to the people. The people are sovereign. They vote for their representatives. The representatives, political representatives, represent the people who voted for them. Hardly a big deal. It used to be how it was in the Western world, but since globalization, no more. So Hungary is actually an unusual case. Now, what are the globalists doing or did do to undermine the Hungarian sovereignty? What are they doing now, and how are the Hungarians stopping the globalists from taking over the country and dictating policy? Now, as we both know, the European Union is a globalist institution, and the European Union is using the European courts and the divvying up of money via the European Union dispersing of receipts and so on. That they're using money in the courts to threaten, cajole, bribe, intimidate, stand over, accuse the Hungarian government. Now, the Hungarian government made a decision that they were to represent the people. Now, that in itself is unique. Every Western country, the globalists very successfully penetrated every political party machine, made sure that the people they wanted to be in Parliament were put in there, all the black and brown and the lesbians and the this and the that, or just people like Joe Biden or whoever, who were just pro-globalisation, or indeed useful stooges for furthering the globalisation project. It kind of didn't matter. But the globalists were able to very successfully corrupt Western politicians. Now, let's take Australia as a case in point. If let's take the time when globalisation really kicked off, big time. There were fits and starts and bits and spurts here and there, and you could see the globalisation or the architecture of it starting to take shape. But it didn't really kick off till about 1990, 1991. In effect, the fall of the Soviet Union, really, that was the time, and when Eastern Europe started to open up to Western influences and capitalism and consumer societies and that sort of stuff. So let's take 1991 just as a point there. That's when globalisation started to kick off. Now in Australia, if I look at all the politicians, certainly the ones that I've looked at, the politicians and the property that they owned when they finished in Parliament prior to excuse me, prior to 1990. I didn't see that coming. Gee, excuse me. Prior to 1990, if I should start again. No, screw it. I'll keep on going. So now the houses that they owned were really middle class houses. So you'd say it was slightly above the median, maybe. They weren't in trashy areas or anything like that. But before the mass migration, the sort of trashy areas were really in few and far between. They were confined into like government housing estates that would sprawl for miles. But outside of that, most of it you'd call lower middle class, upper middle class. But nearly all the politicians, with the exception of the ones who were born into wealth, nearly all the politicians, they they just had houses that, as I say, were about a little bit above the average house price. Because of their service to the people and to the country, the politicians, they were given reasonably generous pension payments until they died, and I agree with that. I think people that have given public service for many years should be looked after in old age, and I've got no problem with that. But they were very much middle class people. You look at some of the houses; they were just pretty ordinary sort of houses. 3 or 4 bedrooms, maybe 1.5 bathrooms type thing, a double carport, but basic stuff. Now compare that to the houses that the same politicians have today, and let's say the average highest price. I'll use Sydney as an example, which is more expensive than a lot of cities, I understand. But say the average house price, freestanding house price, is like 1.3 million, for example. Now, probably a bit more than that. Say 1.4. So we're talking, say, 1.4 to 1.6, 1.7 million using today's prices. It was cheaper, of course, years ago. But that would be the sort of house that a politician would live in. Maybe 2 million. Let's be generous and say high ones, maybe 2 million, but still a good 20% below the threshold that would move you into, say, upper middle class. Now, today, a politician, I'll compare the same position that a ministry, as they call it in Australia, but like in America or Britain would be the Secretary of State or something, that type of thing. So just looking at that now, the last guy who held that post or that position in a similar position in the government, so just recently compared to his contemporary, 35, 40 years ago. Today, the house that he retired in from politics is 15 times the average house price, and is clearly in an upper class, suburb where the well-to-do live. We're talking yachts and private jetties on the waterfront, things like that. So this is the difference. Now, if you look at the politicians around today, they're vastly better off, substantially better off than the politicians were before. So the politicians that were engaged in public service, representing the people, they did all right. They didn't retire in poverty or something like that. But they certainly weren't rich, not by any stretch, and were still squarely in the middle class bracket. And again, these were the people that represented their voters. Today, since the globalists have taken over, those same politicians are far, far richer than they were, and they've all sold out their voters. They've sold them out to the globalists. So clearly the globalists were able to get to pretty much everyone in Western governments, or maybe they made sure that people who were susceptible to this sort of bribery and corruption were the ones that got into government. But not only has there been a lowering of intellectual standards, and it's definitely been that. Some of the federal ministers in government today, they're fucking morons. Seriously, you wouldn't. They should be working on the checkout at the local supermarket. That's the height of their capability. Yet they're being catapulted into the federal ministry on 5, 6, 7, 8 times what they could make in the real world. If they had to sell their skills in a competitive market. So the globalists successfully were able to corrupt pretty much the entire Western political class. Now, because there was a stable party machinery in place that had sort of settled down and was long-standing, it was easier for them to penetrate that party machinery, and that's where they started with it. But they also went through the education departments and the public service and the NGOs that have also ballooned since 1990, 1991, transnational actors as they are. That's also, changed the landscape that today from what it was in 1990 and before 1990. But the corrupting the political class, that was done. Why couldn't they do it in Hungary? Why were they successfully able to corrupt the entire Western world political class? the entire political class of the Western world are corrupted. And you know, it's very sad to think, I didn't think this sort of thing could happen. If someone had told me, 20, 30 years ago that it would be this easy to corrupt our leaders and our political class, I wouldn't have believed it. I just know that I would have said, no, that's rubbish. That's not. But it hasn't. They haven't really had to work that hard to do it. They've just said, well, we'll make you a lot richer than you would have been, and they've all gone down like a sack of shit to the globalists. It's quite remarkable. I just didn't think people in the West were like that. I thought the culture of public service, of representing your electorates, of being incorruptible, or I thought that was going to be, or would have been, too big an obstacle for the globalists to overcome. But it hasn't been. They've done it easily. But why couldn't they do it in Hungary? Why weren't the Hungarian politicians corruptible? I don't know the answer to that. But they haven't been, and if they have been, certainly nowhere near to the scale that the Western political parties and political party machines have. They've all been corrupted. And again, it's all been financial. They've been offered cosy business deals, massive salaries, shady real estate deals. That's the most popular in the shady real estate deals. So they've had all this stuff, and again, they've just sold out to the globalists purely in the base. I mean, would you sell out your fellow countrymen and everything for $10 or $15 million? I mean, if assuming you were a political leader, I don't know. I mean, these people obviously have, and they've done it eagerly and keenly in unison, and they're not. If they have any conscience pangs, gee whiz, it's pretty limited. So anyway, the Hungarian body politic or political class, at least the party in power at the moment, did not sell out to the globalists and isn't showing any sign of it. And there must have been huge inducements, offered to them. We'll give you waterfront homes in Florida, or we'll give you, fancy homes in London, or so. You can imagine the inducements that must have been waved under their noses, and yet they've said no. Now, if we look at how do the globalists undermine any society? They've got the 101 playbook. So they do it through the universities and the high schools, and increasingly now primary school, or early learning school. So they put activists in there. They have the NGOs running around. They have the climate activism, gay, lesbian activism, gender activism, like brutal divorce courts and artificially creating gender. And then they have the mass migration. As soon as they start the mass migration, they then play the race card. So they put all the local people on the defensive. Oh, you're racist, you're Hitler, you're Nazis. When it's the globalists themselves that are pushing all these black and brown peasants into the place, and then accusing the white local indigenous white people of being racist. The fucking height of it, the chutzpah. So what did they do in Hungary, and how did the Hungarian government stop them? This is probably the big issue. So the globalists started putting activist academics into the Hungarian university system. That's a good place to start. Now, at this stage, bear in mind, they haven't corrupted the body politic of Hungary. I think because the party machinery is just too new, following the fall of Eastern Europe, that it hadn't settled down to a point where, as it had in, say, Britain or the United States or Australia, it hadn't settled down to a point where the globalists could penetrate and take over the party machine. That was always the key starting point, and it hadn't really settled down enough in Hungary for them to identify a mass that they could penetrate and control. That may have been the only thing that saved the Hungarians, really. So anyway, they try and bring in activist academics. Now, they tried to do this anyway, even while the Viktor Orban government was in power. So how they do it is this: they go to academics in the university system, particularly the academics who are doing sociology and arts and those sort of subjects. They're always more susceptible and easier to bribe and get at. So they'll say to them things like, well, we'll give you a huge grant, and NGOs as well were playing this game. We'll give you a big grant. United Nations were playing it as well. So they go to an academic, so we'll give you a big grant, which will involve lots and lots of travel to exotic locations. You'll be able to do presentations in the United Nations. You'll be feted as a great genius around the world. You'll be going to all the great universities. You'll be given honorary PhDs from London University and Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and so on. Bonn University. You'll be heralded as a great academic. Statues will be erected and so on. Now that's pretty heady stuff if you've been effectively a lower level bureaucrat academic. Well, what do you want in return for all these goodies? Well, can you just write a few papers saying that Nazis are everywhere in Hungary, and that it's an oppressive state, the government's evil, and gay lesbians are being oppressed, and transphobia is everywhere, and that sort of stuff. So we want you to bring out studies in inverted commas that say these things. And so we in the United Nations then say, there, see, look at it, they're fascist everywhere. So now, if they couldn't do that, they would then take a Hungarian academic out and say, look, we'll give you a gig in New York University or somewhere in the US or somewhere in the West. And then they would do an academic exchange. So they would then bring out a screaming activist academic from the West and insert them as a replacement into the Hungarian university or school system, for that matter, under the guise of an English teacher. They bring out activists, and the NGOs supply them to run around and spread hateful propaganda against the local population, against the government. If you don't allow millions of third world peasants to come into Hungary, then you're all Hitler, you're all fascists and Nazis. To spread that and get that sort of narrative moving. So they did that, and also trying to place, through the United Nations, through the NGOs, and through the classic conduits, trying to place journalists in the local media who would again parrot those globalist talking points. So the globalists attacked from a number of areas, through academia, using the United Nations, the NGOs, and indeed Western governments that were globalist controlled, trying to bring activists into academia, neutralise those that weren't prepared to be activists, make sure grants and money and gifts and goodies were only given to those who would agree to say that everyone in Hungary were Nazis, and so on. The NGOs were also doing this and operating in Hungary, making sure that they were paying off journalists and school teachers. And again, school teachers aren't that hard to, we've decided that there's a scholarship available to go to London to study such and such, black studies, or oppression studies, or gay lesbian studies, lesbian dance theory, whatever. It doesn't matter. To get the high school teachers to go and do that, and offer them, and give them. Now these are lower. These people don't make a lot of money, and then you dazzle their eyes with 5-star London hotels, being met by limousines at the airport, and being taken out to swanky restaurants, and their eyes are dazzled. They're absolutely popping out of their head, and well, what do you want? I'll do anything you want. So this is all this sort of activity is going. Now, how did the Orbán government fight back? I've sort of collated again a number of interviews I've seen from Hungarian officials, so I've sort of amalgamated and synthesized it and put it together. So this is my understanding, that these NGOs were denied all charity status. They're political activists. They're not charities, and they were not permitted to operate in Hungary, or if they were permitted, they had to pay proper taxes like any other business, because they were political actors. They couldn't give grants and handouts to various organisations in return for spreading globalist propaganda. And I think that was was important to ban those people, or make sure they paid taxes like everyone else. So if they gave a grant to somebody, then that had to be fully taxable, and these sorts of things. The other thing, or amongst the other things, was brought out a law that gay, lesbian, and people wanting to transition, and trans people that could not be taught in schools, or people under the age of 18. And that was a very critical thing that just knocked out a lot of that propaganda that the NGOs and the United Nations were doing. And again, this is all part of the globalist thing to undermine society. It's the classic one: climate activism, gay lesbian activism, trans activism, race activism, gender activism. Those are the 5 pillars that they use to undermine all Western societies. And it's been very successful. And again, that they had to take over the body politic and the public services first, but they achieved that. Now they control the media, the public services, the Western body politic, the NGOs. They control everything. The entire media establishment, including big tech, for goodness sakes. So they're able to totally control the West and shout down and crush anyone who even questions what's going on, let alone opposes it. So, look at the entire police force of Britain. Their sole purpose and function now is to protect the globalisation project. They're not there to maintain law and order or apply the rule of law. Far from it. They're just there to promote and protect the globalisation project from not only those who may oppose it, for those who may question it, for goodness sakes. So the Hungarians were able to neutralise every one of those 5 things. So the NGOs that do the climate activism, they can't operate in Hungary as NGOs. If they want to pay all the taxes, want to pay all the bills, that's different. But they can't go around as propaganda outfits and be tax exempt. The gay, lesbian, the trans stuff's been neutralised. Now, if you want to study lesbian dance theory or gender studies or any of these sorts of things in university, you're free to do it, but you won't get any government taxpayer-funded assistance, nor are you allowed to accept scholarships from outside. So these NGOs and the United Nations, that's something they're not recognised. You have to pay it yourself. Nor is it available in every university, and because they're not getting a free ride from the taxpayer or the UN or something like that, then the demand for it's quite small. So only the bigger colleges would handle it anyway. So that sort of knocks that out. It's actually not hard to stop the globalist playbook. Those 5 pillars of how to undermine any society. All you got to do is for a bit of fine tuning, the NGOs have to pay taxes and these sorts of things. Now, in return, the Western media, of course, have gone into hyperdrive over this. Transphobia, fascism. So they've gone insane. But in reality, the Orban government, all they've done is push back against those prime globalist methods to undermine any society. That five trick playbook that the Hungarian government has quite reasonably and sensibly, and I think moderately, pushed back against that and neutralised it, and that drives the globalists insane. How can we undermine your society unless you let us destroy it? Well, they're not letting you destroy it, you dickheads. So anyway, that's the sort of my perception of what's going on in Hungary, and I congratulate and applaud what they're doing. I wish we had politicians in the West would do that. I don't know how much longer they can hold out, because the European Union, the United Nations, every device the globalists have at their disposal, they are using to try and crush and undermine the government, including saying, well, they're far right and the elections are illegitimate and so on, which is, again, the globalist playbook. The election of any government they don't like is illegitimate. The election of any government that they do like, no matter how flaky the election process is legitimate. So, again, part of the globalist playbook. I'll be interested in seeing your comments below, and my apologies for the sneezing. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.